Hi, welcome to another book review with your friend and host, John Henry Sheridan. Today on the roster is A Concise History of the Catholic Church by Thomas Bokenkotter. A Concise History of the Catholic Church by Thomas Bokenkotter. Bokenkotter, I'm not sure. All right, so this was published in 1977. By Doubleday and Company. All right, so I've been looking forward to posting this for a long time, but now that the moment is here, it's hard to know what to say. Okay, so as part of my journey as a reader, I'm been reading things the past couple of years, especially geared towards helping me write my autobiography. So I was born and raised Catholic, and for years, well, my whole life, I've had a curiosity about the Catholic Church. I stopped practicing Catholicism and I went on a seeking path, eventually discovering Buddhism, which I still practice, and I also meditate and just kind of trust the universe. That's kind of where I'm at. But I've always been curious why I have some positive feelings towards the church and some not so positive feelings. And I feel like my character, who I am today, at the age of 43, in the year 2024, has a lot to do with how I was born and raised. And I was raised a Catholic. Now, my mother was raised a Lutheran. My father was the Catholic, but so that's also part of my story, but also just Catholicism in itself. It's always had so many questions for me. So I figured, let's just do it. Let's dive in. And this was probably the best resource I could find. I like shopping on for books at what's the place I use? Thriftbooks.com. And instead of giving all business in the world to Amazon, I like to use other online platforms. Thrift Books is good. And anyway, I try to go for books that interest me and also have a decent price range. So I always buy used books. There's no point in buying new books unless I have to. Or maybe to support the author if I know them personally. But anyway, so this I found, I don't know, I'm guessing for $10 or something like that. I don't remember. Could have been less. All right, so let's get into it. I don't know how many people I could expect might read this in the future from this review or from hearing about it, because it's a little dry. It's very good for what history can be. It's not just chock full of dates and names and numbers and documents. It's got some stories of personal people, and this guy, he is at the time of the writing, I think he was still a priest or a former priest. No, Reverend Thomas Bokenkotter. Okay, so it sounds like he's a reverend at the time of this writing. But it doesn't sound very biased towards Catholicism, saying like this is the way. But at the same time, it is a little biased, and there are words that he uses, such as like, then, there was a victory in this year, meaning that, he thought that this Catholic occurrence in their favor was a victory. So it's a little bit colored. It's not 100%, what's the word, neutral, but fairly neutral. He does offer various points of view, and he readily shares the flaws of the church, and he tries to show both sides of whatever argument's going on at the time, because in history, the Catholic Church is full, I emphasize it, full of arguing and fighting. Full of it, okay? I have to emphasize that so much because that's just what jumped at me. Like, no wonder it's so convoluted is the word I want to use. Just so much fighting, and much of this fighting and arguing comes from the popes themselves, comes from, of course, the bishops who were under the popes, or cardinals. The priests historically tend to be a little more balanced because they interact with the ordinary people, but at the same time, some priests, anyone who held a position in the church because we're talking about hundreds and hundreds, literally 2,000 years, there was a lot of variety of what the church looked like in that time, and for a long period, certainly during the Middle Ages and the sort of Dark Ages before that, there was a lot of nepotism, people getting their son or their cousin into the position because, you know someone, you get them in, that type of thing, and to a leadership in the church position. So obviously it's going to get corrupted. They're not coming to it from a seeking spirit because they just want to seek God and devote themselves to God. But of course there were those people too. And the church does have a pure essence somewhere within it. So there is the purity of the church, it's real. And there is this very human, mundane, impure aspect of the Catholic Church history. And a lot of pride, a lot of ego, a lot of wanting to maintain the status quo. So the book itself, what happens when I'm learning, what happens when you read history books talking about hundreds of years is human beings like readers, us, we like stories. And when you're talking about huge swaths of time, hundreds of years, unless you're picking out a story or like a vague story, like, the Protestants versus the Catholics, at least there's something to kind of grasp onto. It's hard to process what's going on. It's like, instead of like details drawing a face, you get like these like sweeping brushes with a million faces in there, so it's like, what's happening, and there's not a lot of writing at certain periods of the church history. There's just not. Certainly for the first couple hundred, there are some existing, which is amazing. In the first, second, third, maybe not first much, but second, third, fourth century, there are some writings. After that, there are some. And there are periods where there's a lot of writings, but also it's a lot of times the writings are very rigid, like you don't detect the person there, you just detect like this authoritarian figure speaking on behalf of an organization. So it's hard to really write history about that in a lot of ways, unless you have accounts of people and their personalities and their trajectories and their desires and their goals, but it was fascinating. It helped me to learn that the Catholic Church history is super complex. One thing I appreciate now is that even though in the Middle Ages the church could be very, even barbaric in terms of like sending people to the Inquisition, like basically grilling them and threatening them with death or torture if they don't say that they're Catholic or they don't like deny another faith. Barbaric, right? And then there's, of course, the Crusades, which popes sent huge groups of people to Israel to basically destroy Muslims and take the holy city for themselves. It didn't work. It didn't work at all. I think there were 3 crusades, if I'm not mistaken, possibly 4, and they were successively weaker, I think. Maybe the first 2 were similar, and they just kind of dwindled off because people lost the spirit. Like, what are we doing this for? I don't know. It's a lot of times the Crusaders stayed in Israel and just like formed their own businesses and, of course, harmonized to some degree with whatever people were there, different faiths, because, they didn't want to go all the way back home to what? to this madman who sent them off there to kill people for the name of God. It didn't make sense. So there was a lot of craziness like that. And then for a long time, I'm saying during the Middle Ages, making sweeping generalities, but kings and popes were very tied in. So the Catholic Church and the monarchy were always linked. Why? Essentially because they were doing the same thing. They were controlling the populace. The monarchy was the ruling body of the secular world, and then the Catholic Church was the ruling body of the spiritual world. At least in Europe, that was by and large the case. And even though you could look, like sort of going to say, you could look and say what the popes did, what certain eras of Catholic history did was barbaric. Yes, and the rules could be very strict and very ridiculous. It's by our standards today. But outside of the church, there was a lot of anarchy and chaos at various points in history. And, you know, robbers and people with like no standards and no morals that would just like come and take over your land, take over your farm, marauders, you know, a lot of scary stuff. So for people to know that somewhere in the universe, and of course you couldn't trust your king, sometimes your king was like just robbing from you as well. So somewhere in the universe there's an authority that was just. And even though being poor and being low class was a very difficult thing that nobody really wanted, at least there was some benefit of being poor. There was some benefit to, which is what Christianity was teaching, that, you know, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. So there was this like solace. And then if a pope came and, you know, contradicted the king, that was acceptable at different eras. So that made ordinary people feel at least there's some counterbalance to the monarch that may be off. Or at least there's some authority in the world somewhere when it seemed like everything was anarchy. So that helps me understand why the church existed in such a impure way for so long, because even that impure state seemed to be beneficial or almost necessary for the environments, the climate of that time that was so chaotic and barbaric to some degrees. And then later on, you see how the church becomes weaker in the 16th, 17th, during the Enlightenment. As long as people got empowered, thinking for themselves, the authority of the church becomes questioned, threatened. They want a pope throughout history wants to hold power a lot of time. Some popes are a little more liberal, a little more truly spiritual, but to get the position, it would really be hard for a person to actually be that way. They have to have some sort of aggressiveness for them to be elected to that office. Most of the history, again, broad generalizations, but yeah, and then by the time you get to our time, so there's a lot of upheaval in the 1800s because you had the French Revolution. I think the Russian Revolution was around the time. I don't know how much that impacted it. I'm sure it did. But particularly the French Revolution really upset the balance of power. You know, the rich versus the poor. And of course, the rich were connected to the monarchy and the church. A lot of the church positions, the bishops, the abbots, whatever. So that got upset, and then people wanted this like revolutionary new rule of the land. And then people of the new way kind of want to erase the old way, which included even the church and Catholicism itself. So there was like an anti-Catholic thing that happened for a while. And then anti-Catholicism happened at other time periods as well. So the more the church was pressed to become pure, the more its longevity was strengthened. So whenever the society really pressed the church to change or challenge it, the purity would rise. So I guess that's why it survived in a sense also because there is something pure about it, but the impurities also allowed it to continue on the general stage, the popular stage, the 3D world. This is all my how I just interpret it through the filters that I have. So yeah, I'm glad I had that Catholic upbringing. I can see the benefits. I could see where it could have damaged me in some ways with the dogmas, you know, the guilt, stuff like that. The fears, you know, there's guilt and fear in there that I don't believe in now, but it was in there, you know, when I was growing up. But there's also the love and the mercy and you know, the kindness and the charity, which is also in there. So, and then you got to the 1960s. The church was still really old school in many ways. And then this Pope Paul, I think it was, Paul II, I don't remember what the number was. Pope Paul was kind of this open-minded guy. Before John Paul II, Pope Paul, and he created this Vatican II thing. I think I got that right. And that really just somehow the world was ready for it. We had gone through, you know, Martin Luther King was out, and Malcolm X, and you know, I think the Ferguson bus, the bus strike, whatever that was. That was in the 50s, I think. So civil rights was happening. People were ready for a change. Couldn't hold it back anymore. And then Vatican II embodied that change. And that shook up the church, because a lot of people were used to the church being a certain way. Now all of a sudden, they're not speaking Latin anymore. They're speaking the native language. Now the priests are facing the audience, or the faithful, and they're not turning their back. So some of the magic is lost. People are questioning things more. And then the role of the priest changes so much, because now people are more informed. They don't have to rely on the priest for their questions about theology. They could just do their own research. They could read. They could think for themselves. They could read the Bible. They could read interpretations of the Bible. And the priest might be less informed about issues than they are. And then maybe let's say the Catholic Church disagrees with using contraception, and the faithful person doesn't disagree with it. They do agree with it. Then there's going to be this mistrust. So various things like that would happen, and then the church just became weaker to the point where in 77, when he published this, Thomas Bokenkotter said that the church is in a crisis. And I saw the books on my dad's shelf from the late 70s, early 80s about, can we save the Catholic Church? Like it was on a decline at that time. From my interpretation, I visit churches now still sometimes. It still seems to be on a decline, or not a significant upswing. This is my impression from where I am. But it's hanging in there, that's for sure. It's hanging in there. And some places are alive and well, so don't get me wrong, I'm not condemning it or anything. It's just my sort of somewhat neutral perspective. I don't want to see it go one way or the other. Actually, if I wanted anything, I would want to see just a very open-minded, loving, embracing, pure-hearted faith that helped people and didn't scare them. Didn't use fear tactics, didn't use guilt tactics, just pure, unconditional love. That's what I would like to see in the church. But whatever. Anyway, so do I recommend it? Only for the strongly curious. I can't imagine ordinary reader would get through it unless you have a deep curiosity. There were many times I found myself drowning. Like, I'm saying, this is a great book for a concise history of the Catholic Church. It's so complicated. It's gonna put you to sleep no matter who writes it, I'm sure, at some point. It wasn't so much that I was going to sleep, it was like I felt like I was drowning. like going underwater, and I was just popping up and then forgot everything that just happened. I'm just trying to survive to get through it, to swim from one shore to the other in choppy waters. So it wasn't so much that it was boring, it was just that it was just too much information. I got lost. Sometimes you didn't clarify things, and I just want to finish it because I was getting something out of it, but there'll be a lot of parts where I just didn't really know what was going on. But as you can see, I did a 20-minute video. Obviously, I got something out of it, right? So, Thomas Bokenkotter, thank you. This is a book from a different era for a specific group of people, perhaps, I don't know. But anyway, it benefits me in the year 2024. Nearly 50 years after you wrote it, so kudos to you. And see you next time. Keep reading.